You know the type. They never take credit. They deflect every compliment with a small wave of the hand. They speak softly, hold back, call themselves nothing special. And somehow, you always end up feeling worse after talking to them. Not much worse, just a degree or two. A faint residue you can't name. You walk away from the conversation vaguely diminished, unsure why, half convinced you imagined it. Because they were so modest. Because they said all the right things. Because nothing they did could be called an attack. That feeling is information. And Nietzsche would have recognized it immediately. He spent a significant portion of his working life studying a particular kind of human being, the person who builds their power not by rising, but by making others feel they should crouch. The person whose weapon is not ambition or arrogance, but the performance of having none. He called the moral psychology behind this ressentiment, and the false humility that wears it as a costume was, in his view, one of the most dangerous forces in human social life. This is not a video about arrogant people. Arrogant people are easy. You see them coming. This is about the ones you almost never see coming, because they have convinced themselves and everyone around them that they're the opposite of dangerous. If this is already landing, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. Nietzsche introduced ressentiment most fully in On the Genealogy of Morality, published in 1887. The word is French, and he kept it French deliberately. The English word resentment is too thin for what he meant. Ressentiment is not a flash of anger. It is a slow, structural condition. It is what happens to a person who feels powerless to act on their frustration. So they turn inward and begin to rewrite their weakness as virtue. The person who cannot compete starts to call competition vulgar. The person who will not take risks begins to describe risk-taking as recklessness. The person who fears standing out reframes their obscurity as humility. The psychology doesn't stop at self-deception. It becomes a social project. The goal, Nietzsche argued, is to drag the standard of human behavior down to where you already are, and then call that the moral high ground. False humility is ressentiment with a pleasant face. It is not the same as genuine modesty, which Nietzsche did not oppose. Genuine modesty is accurate self-assessment. It does not perform. It does not require an audience. The person who is truly humble about their work says little about it and does more of it. The person performing humility needs you to see the performance. The self-deprecation is not a confession. It is a claim. It says, look at how little I think of myself. And the unspoken demand underneath it is, now you must disagree with me, and in disagreeing, confirm my worth. That is the mechanism. What follows are the ways it operates. The first thing to understand is that performed humility almost always travels with a hidden ledger. When someone deflects every compliment, what looks like modesty is actually a transaction running in the background. They say they're nothing special. You correct them. They say no, really it was nothing. You insist. And somewhere in the exchange, they have received something, reassurance, attention, the specific satisfaction of being argued out of low self-regard, without ever having to ask for it directly. This is what Nietzsche described as the indirect will to power. Power, he argued throughout beyond good and evil, and the genealogy, does not always announce itself. It frequently operates through the appearance of its opposite. The person who publicly renounces desire often wants more than the person who admits wanting. The person who refuses to compete has simply moved the competition underground, where it runs without rules. The ledger they keep is real. They track who acknowledged their sacrifice, who noticed their restraint, who failed to give them credit. And because the currency of the relationship was never made explicit, because they never asked, only performed, the debt can never be paid. Every expression of recognition creates a new obligation. Every compliment that lands too quickly marks you as someone who doesn't understand how much they've given. You were supposed to fight harder to convince them. You have probably met this person in a workplace. They are always the first to say they don't need recognition. They insist loudly that the project was a team effort. And yet, when the praise goes elsewhere, something in the room shifts. A silence. A small withdrawal. The performance of not caring. deployed at the exact moment when caring has become undeniable. What they wanted was for you to notice the performance. What they cannot forgive is that you didn't. The second thing to understand is what false humility does to the people around it. Nietzsche wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that the person who is always giving without asking produces a particular kind of exhaustion in those who receive. He was suspicious of unconditional generosity, not because generosity is bad, but because generosity without honesty is a form of control. When someone gives endlessly and refuses to name what they need, they are not being selfless. They are making themselves impossible to refuse and impossible to repay. Think of the person in your family who does everything for everyone and accepts nothing in return, who cooks, organizes, manages, absorbs, never complains, and reminds you quietly but consistently of all they have absorbed. Their sacrifice is real. The suffering is real. But notice what the sacrifice produces. A relationship in which every gesture carries weight, in which gratitude is the permanent condition of everyone around them, in which the question of what do you want is always redirected back to what do you need, because I'm fine. That redirection is not innocent. It is a power structure, and the person at the center of it maintains their position precisely by refusing to occupy it explicitly. They are never in charge. They're just always indispensable. They never demand. They just make demands feel ungrateful. This is the exhausting property of performed humility. It puts the burden of the relationship's health entirely on the other person. The false humble person can never be wrong because they never claim to want anything. They can never be confronted because they have already condemned themselves more harshly than you could. Every attempt to address the dynamic bounces off a shield of self-reproach. I know, I'm terrible. I always mess things up. And you are left holding the contradiction, unable to agree without cruelty, unable to disagree without falling into the transaction they designed. The third thing, and this is where it becomes uncomfortable, is that false humility often carries contempt inside it. Not contempt they would admit. Not contempt they are even fully conscious of. But Nietzsche was specific about this. Ressentiment is not a neutral emotion. It requires a target. The person trapped in the psychology of performed smallness does not simply feel diminished by their own limitations. They feel diminished by people who do not share those limitations. Your confidence is evidence against them. Your visible desire is an accusation. Your refusal to be modest is proof in their inner courtroom that you are exactly the kind of person who needs to be brought down. This contempt rarely surfaces directly. What surfaces is something far more effective. It surfaces as concern. They worry about you. They wonder, quietly, whether you're being realistic. They hope, with what looks like genuine care, that you know what you're doing. They remember out loud the last time someone they knew tried something like this. They do not attack. They fret. They furrow their brow. They hand you their anxiety wrapped in affection, and the effect, the specific, measurable effect, is that you begin to doubt. Nietzsche named this mechanism with precision. In the genealogy, he described how the weak invert the values of the strong, not through argument, but through moral reframing. What you call ambition, they call hubris. What you call self-respect, they call vanity. What you call desire, they call greed. The inversion happens so consistently and is so deeply embedded in the social contract of false modesty that it becomes difficult to feel good about your own forward motion without checking it against their worry. Their anxiety becomes your compass. That is the victory. If this video is giving you something to think about, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep making content like this. The fourth thing is the most specific and the most worth sitting with. False humility is frequently a verdict delivered without a trial. There is a habit that highly performative self-deprecators develop over time. They preemptively diminish themselves in ways that also diminish you. The structure is subtle enough that most people miss it. It goes something like this. You mention something you're proud of. Before you can finish, they're already talking about how they could never do something like that, how they're just not built that way, how it requires gifts they simply don't have. The surface of the statement is self-deprecation. What it does in practice is make the thing you did strange or exceptional or contingent on personal traits that are being framed as unusual. The conversation has moved from what you did to what kind of person does that. And the implied answer is, not most people, not normal people. It sounds like admiration. It functions as isolation. If you notice yourself surrounded by people who consistently respond to your progress with elaborate confessions of their own inadequacy, if your good news is always the occasion for their self-examination rather than your celebration, pay attention to what that pattern produces over time. It produces a version of you that has learned to share less, aim quieter, trim what you admit to wanting. You have been educated into smallness by people who told you, the whole time, that they were your greatest admirers. The sixth thing is perhaps the most disorienting to experience, because it uses the language of virtue against you. False humility has a particular relationship with guilt. Not the guilt that comes from having done something wrong, the guilt that comes from having done something right in front of the wrong person. You will recognize this if you have ever felt, after a genuine success, that you needed to apologize for it. Not because you did anything harmful, but because someone in your vicinity made the atmosphere around your success so heavy with their own quiet suffering that joy became inconsiderate. You found yourself minimizing, hedging, adding qualifiers. It was mostly luck. I had a lot of help. I'm not sure it will last. You did not arrive at those words on your own. You were trained into them, gradually, by someone whose performed smallness had made your visible satisfaction feel like an act of aggression. Nietzsche was direct about this. He argued in Beyond Good and Evil that guilt is one of the most effective instruments of social control ever developed, and that it is most powerful when it has no specific accusation attached to it. When someone accuses you of something concrete, you can respond to it. When someone simply suffers in your presence, when they make their pain quietly legible without ever naming you as its cause, you are left with a formless obligation. You owe them something. You're not sure what. The uncertainty keeps you managing their emotional state indefinitely. The person performing humility almost never says your success hurts me. They would never say that. What they do instead is become visibly smaller each time you become visibly larger. They sigh. They grow quiet. They reflect on their own failures at the moment you are describing your progress. And a message arrives without words. Your rising is related to their sinking. The connection is never stated. It doesn't need to be. You feel it, and you start to manage it. And in managing it, you have accepted a responsibility that was never yours to carry. The seventh thing is what holds all of this together, and it is the darkest part. The person performing humility has usually convinced themselves it is genuine. This is what separates what Nietzsche was describing from ordinary hypocrisy. The ordinary hypocrite knows the gap between their public face and their private motivation. The person in the grip of ressentiment does not. They have closed the gap by rewriting the motivation. They genuinely experience their self-deprecation as honesty. They genuinely experience their worry about you as love. They genuinely experience their furrowed brow as concern for your well-being rather than anxiety at your independence. The inversion is not performed consciously. It is metabolized. It has become the structure of how they see themselves in relation to the world. This is why confronting it rarely works. You cannot argue someone out of a self-concept that functions as their primary source of moral identity. Their humility is not a tactic they could abandon if you named it. It is who they believe they are. To suggest otherwise is not a critique. It is an attack on their entire self-understanding. And the response will be exactly what you would expect from someone who has built their identity on moral superiority through self-negation. They will become the wounded one. The conversation will end with you comforting them for having noticed what they did to you. Nietzsche did not think most people caught in this psychology were villains. He thought they were people who had found a way to extract power from limitation, and that the tragedy of it was how little they knew they were doing it. The suffering is real. The self-denial is real. What is not real is the story they tell about why. So what do you do with this? Now what do you do to them? Nietzsche was not interested in correction as a project. His entire philosophical life was oriented against the idea that you could reason someone into a different relationship with their own will. What he was interested in was what the recognition costs you and what it might free you from. The first thing it frees you from is the obligation to match the performance. When you understand that performed humility is a social demand, a request that you also minimize yourself so that their minimization becomes the shared currency of the relationship, you can decline the exchange. Not loudly, not with an announcement. You simply stop offering the matching self-deprecation. You stop treating your progress as something that requires apology. You answer the compliment without deflecting it. You say the thing is going well without immediately supplying evidence that it might not last. This will feel, the first several times, like arrogance. That feeling is the system working on you. It is the trained reflex of someone who has learned that visible self-respect is socially dangerous. It is not arrogance. It is accuracy. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the Overman, is frequently misread as something grandiose. What it actually describes, at its core, is a person who has stopped measuring themselves against the fears and resentments of those around them and started measuring themselves against what they are capable of becoming. That is not a superhuman project. It is the ordinary, difficult work of refusing to shrink. The second thing recognition frees you from is the rescue impulse. When you understand that the suffering of the chronically self-deprecating person is not an accident, not a deficit waiting for your correction, but a structure, one that produces specific social effects and meets specific psychological needs, you can stop trying to fix it. You can stop offering reassurances that are consumed and immediately need to be offered again. You can stop being the mirror in which their smallness becomes legible as virtue. This is not coldness. It is a refusal to participate in a system that damages you both. The third thing is harder. It requires looking at whether you have been doing any of this yourself. Most people have. The psychology Nietzsche described is not rare. It is in some degree nearly universal, because the alternative requires a tolerance for the discomfort of being genuinely seen, genuinely wanting something, genuinely failing without converting the failure into a moral credential. Self-deprecation, as a reflex, is often protection. It gets the critique in before the critic does. It preempts judgment by delivering it first, in a form you control. If you have done this, and most people reading the description will recognize at least some version of it in themselves, Nietzsche's answer is not guilt. It is examination. The question is whether the smallness you perform is the smallness you have decided to inhabit. There is a line that appears in various forms across Nietzsche's later work, not as an instruction, but as a kind of diagnostic. The question of whether you are creating your life or simply reacting to it, whether the values you live by were chosen or inherited from people who needed you to stay where you were, whether the modesty you carry is accuracy or armor. The people who use humility as a weapon are not the primary danger. The primary danger is what you do in response to them. Whether, over enough time, in enough relationships built on this dynamic, you absorb their verdict. Whether you begin to manage your own ambition the way you learn to manage their discomfort. Whether the ceiling they needed you to stay beneath becomes the ceiling you enforce on yourself, without anyone needing to ask. Nietzsche's answer to ressentiment was not resentment in return. It was what he called the revaluation of values. A clear-eyed examination of which beliefs about yourself came from your own experience and which came from someone else's need. Most people never do this work. It is easier to perform modesty than to define precisely what you actually want and then stand in front of it without apology. The most dangerous thing about people who pretend to be humble is not what they do to you directly. It is what you do to yourself after enough years of taking their measure of you seriously. The chains they build are borrowed. You are the one who decides whether to keep wearing them. Thank you for watching. More videos are on your screen now. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one. The fifth thing concerns what happens when you stop performing smallness around them. This is the diagnostic moment. This is the test Nietzsche's framework predicts with almost uncomfortable accuracy. When you stop deflecting your own competence, when you say plainly, yes, I work hard on that and I'm pleased with how it came out, When you stop competing with their self-deprecation by offering your own, something changes in the room. Not always dramatically. Often it is just a degree or two, a small stiffness, a fractional withdrawal of warmth. Because the implicit contract of the relationship was a mutual performance of modesty, and you have just broken it. Their modesty required your matching modesty to be legible as modesty. Without your reflection, it reads as something else. And it is something else. What tends to follow is one of two moves. The first is an escalation of the self-deprecation. Louder, more insistent, pulling harder for the correction you're no longer providing. The second is a quiet reclassification of who you are. You become someone who takes themselves too seriously. You become difficult. You have changed. These are the words of ressentiment organizing itself against a new threat. Nietzsche's point was not that this is evil. He was not a moralist in the conventional sense. His point was that it is a recognizable structure, that it runs on specific fuel, and that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The fuel is not hatred. It is the unbearable comparison. It is what happens when a person has invested their identity in their own limitation, and you keep showing up as evidence that the limitation was chosen.